You're muted, Steve.
So, hey, hopefully that means Aftermath didn't just kick over to another show. Welcome to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Boykin, and I am in some freaking hotel room because the interwebs at my new place is not up to streaming speed. So we're going to sort all of that out. I am joined by my better than your co-host, Glory Jones. What's up, Jones? How you doing?
It's a tropical depression here in Florida.
Tropical depression in Florida, okay, is just normally like heroin and pill-induced depression in Eureka, California. I cannot wait to get back onto the mountain. I've like slept peacefully the last 2 nights in a row. It's amazing.
Woo!
I have slept and I have eaten more than once a day. Yeah. That whole cost of living plummets, and then feeding your family doesn't become so hard. So then feeding you becomes much less hard. There you are, Jay Dyer. Hey. Welcome to the show. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you, man. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, man. Glad to be here. Remember, I think we chatted a little bit one time on a Union of the Unwanted stream just briefly, and then
yeah.
I've caught a few of you guys' broadcasts on Rockfin, so glad to be here.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you, and my buddy Jason Burma speaks very highly of you, and I've been a fan of your work for quite a while. I remember I had one of my cousins was like obsessed with Hollywood Decoded, like obsessed with it, and so whenever I would go see him, we would like sit around and smoke joints and watch that show, and it was just wild. This is why you're here today. The intelligence community influence in not just film and television, but everything that we think of as media. Certainly in 2021 is incredibly pervasive, but it's got a history of that. It's almost got a foundation in that. And this is much more your wheelhouse than ours. So we're basically like a freaking classroom at this point. And are here to get our brains exploded.
Well, thanks, dude. Yeah, I find this to be a really fascinating topic. It's something that I studied in school, and so I read so much on it, I got kind of sick of it. But basically, ever since the beginning of the camera, governments have seen the potential to tell stories that would more or less back up government narratives. And so pretty early on, you can see movies and stories being used as propaganda. The early days of Hollywood, the teens and the 20s, you had pretty big, propaganda movies that Howard Hughes made. You have the Soviets doing the exact same thing with the camera during the Cold War with a lot of the Russian nationalist films, which is odd. You wouldn't think that Soviets would make patriotic films, but they actually did. This was actually fostered during the Stalin period. You have, obviously Germany, Nazi Germany utilized the camera to tell a lot of propaganda. So this is an old technique, I'm trying to say. And what maybe a lot of people don't know is how intertwined the two worlds of intelligence and Hollywood are and have been, as I said, for so long. And it's really easily seen when you look at the Bond series. I did a lot of research on that. My grad work was on the Bond series as a psychological warfare operation. And when you look at somebody like Ian Fleming, who creates that character, he's basically using a composite of a bunch of different real spies and real operations, and even things that he in his own life that he went through as a high-level naval intelligence psychological warfare expert. He put those into these, fictional, goofy novels about James Bond, and then they become movies. And so, that's one of the great examples of, one of the biggest franchises in the history of movies is itself a big Cold War propaganda tool. So that definitely goes on today. And just last thing I was going to say is that when we think about, recent movies in the last 5 or 10 years, you've got Argo, you've got American Sniper, you've got All these movies about the Bin Laden story with Zero Dark 30. Those are all basically CIA created propaganda films.
Hurt Locker, right? Yeah. Well, God damn it, I had it and I lost it. And it was about James Bond. That's right. So you hear so much around the mythos of James Bond and the connection with Roald Dahl and who Ian Fleming really was, and then you kind of get into like what those people were like in their real life and some of the circles that they traveled in. And not only does the entire James Bond world sort of encapsulate a propaganda operation, as you said, psychological operation, but these are also the people who at the time were like swimming in what would have been the Epstein circles of the day. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, Aristotle Onassis, of course, famously the big, the Greek billionaire, he wanted to fund all of the original Bond movies. He didn't end up doing that, but he was really good friends with Ian Fleming, and Ian Fleming came from a pretty prominent banking family out of England and Scotland. And so he went to all these, elite universities, and he saw how you're recruited, typically at the universities. He was recruited there, went into naval intelligence. That's why James Bond is a naval officer, right? Who then goes into British intelligence, because that's what happened to Ian Fleming. So, yeah, a lot of those guys, they're all in the same circles. Sometimes there's a book that Richard Grove's always referring to called The Irregulars, which deals with that circle of people. And they actually played an instrumental role, not just in all this fictional stuff, but in setting up the U.S. CIA, right? So they actually came over here and worked with Bill Donovan, a guy out of Canada called William Stevenson, codename Intrepid. He worked with Bill Donovan to set up the OSS in 1942, which would become the CIA.
And we just had on Elizabeth Voss a couple of weeks ago, who's been doing an excellent series on the Finders.
I've got some of her essays right here. It's funny you said that.
Nice.
I mean, she's incredible, and she's become a friend over the last couple of years. Very, very, very valuable conversations that have come out of that relationship. But she was in the Finders. She talks about I can't remember his first name, but Petty, the guy who founded it, who had intelligence connections predating the OSS, and I had a couple of questions that maybe you might be able to have some insight on, relating to like the Tavistock Institute's influence on the officers that helped create the OSS from British intelligence, and then also the possibility that a lot of these Finders children from 40, 50 years ago may now be prominent members in the American political system. And I would like to know what your opinion on that is. It's obviously speculation, obviously. So if you're willing to take the boat ride to Speculation Island, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there is some precedent for that. A lot of the experiments were done on children, and that's been going on for many decades. I just uncovered the other day, I thought I had it in here, but there's a speech. I think it's called the Greenbaum speech, and it's a speech by a psychologist from a long time ago, delivered at a conference of people on ritual abuse. And in this speech, he actually discusses what you're talking about, that a lot of people have been put into systemic ritual abuse through cults. He doesn't name anybody specific or high profile people, but he is referring to decades of this going on. If you look up Paul Bonacci's testimony, he was connected to the Franklin cover-up. Paul Bonacci alleges that he was under Michael Aquino in one of these Monarch programs where they were trying to do the very thing you said, that they were going to train young people into being this next generation of kind of occult brainwashed sort of individuals that would then move into high positions in government, finance, media, all over. So there are programs like that, and it's definitely plausible. In fact, I was just reading some old papers the other day from John Marks, who wrote multiple critiques of the CIA going back to the 70s. He has an essay I dug up on Dr. John Gittinger, who was basically the guy who created all the personality assessment stuff, right? So like INTF or whatever, all that personality stuff. I'm a passive, INTF. I don't even know what they stand for, but he was doing all that for the CIA. So he was working for MKUltra to try to map out all the different types of personalities, and he came up with like, I don't know, a few thousand of them. And they were actually doing research on high-level individuals, politicians, actors, business moguls, and so forth, even back in the 60s and 70s, to try to map the entire sphere of the human social dynamic domain, I guess you could say. And they wanted to have a scientifically accurate way to predict how people operate. Anyway, point of all that was just to say that they even specified that they wanted to also master and recruit deviants. So this is about the third or fourth thing I've come across now, which vindicates the specific recruitment and usage of psychopaths, serial killers, deviants, sexual deviants especially. And they wanted to even have it down to a science to know, okay, so this dude is a mega super creeper into XYZ. We can use him and control him by XYZ. And that goes all the way back to Bill Donovan saying that, yeah, sometimes we have to recruit some of the most deviant people in society to work for us.
Damn.
What's fascinating about that is that there's got to be some sort of, I don't know if it's because I'm trying not to sound like a complete crazy person here, right? Like that's the challenge, I suppose. But when you look at like the serial killers of the 70s and the 80s,
yeah,
what you're describing right now, dispassionately, just from looking at history, you would kind of automatically be led to, well, is it possible then that like Son of Sam had been exposed to this kind of programming? Yep. Is it possible? Exactly. So that sort of rolls over into modern day false flag stuff, where there kind of seems to be really disparate narratives surrounding things like Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, exactly who and what David Koresh was and what Waco was, things like that. And it at least opens up the realm for possible consideration that a lot of these people have been subject to this kind of programming throughout the years. How pervasive and how, long is the legacy of person-to-person psychological experiments where you're taking a personality quote-unquote defect and weaponizing it for the purposes of the state?
Yeah, that's the thing that we don't know is how extensive a lot of this is. And that's what kind of years later we have to kind of retrace and kind of piece together from the available data. And actually, the way the internet works, I mean, every day there's basically the potential for new information on these topics, right? I mean, like this old John Marks essay that I just dug up from, I don't even know when, it looks like it's from the 80s or the 90s, maybe even the 70s. And, this is a lengthy analysis of a whole angle of MKUltra that I'd never seen before. And I've read most of the kind of public books on MKUltra that are out there. So, there's always the potential to piece together new puzzle, sections of the puzzle or whatever. But I would say that probably in many cases, those people are at least provocateured and perhaps potentially put through some kind of brainwashing operation. We know that Theodore Kaczynski spent time in MKUltra. We know that somebody like Tim McVeigh that you mentioned, I think it's very odd that Dr. Jolyon West, who's one of the most famous MKUltra doctors, he ends up being the court-appointed doctor to Timothy McVeigh and Jack Ruby. I mean, this is just wild stuff, right? Like, so he worked with Jack Ruby, he worked with Timothy McVeigh. So there you have actually a organized crime element. And when you mention Son of Sam, a lot of the research that I've been doing lately about serial killers and organized crime, that's how that world connects. So the organized crime world connects directly to the intelligence world. Everybody should know this from the history of drugs and intelligence agencies basically trafficking, heroin. We've all seen this with Afghanistan recently, right? So this shouldn't be foreign to us, but it's. I think a lot of people just have a hard time thinking that these seemingly disparate worlds are actually really interconnected. And ironically, there are movies at times that actually make these big connections. I was just watching RoboCop the other day. And,
oh my God.
And in RoboCop, I just realized that the big my wife and I, Jamie, were watching this, and the big corporation, Omnicorp, they actually want to gentrify the whole city. So they're participating in destroying the city through like the proliferating drugs, like hardcore drugs, right? And then they're going to rebuild the city, and they're going to privatize the police force. And the same corporation that will own the private police force is then also has a deal with the drug dealers to then sell drugs to the rebuilt city so that it can get destroyed and rebuilt again. So it's like the corporations or the elites over here, the intelligence elite corporations, et cetera, they're basically running the cops and the organized crime at the same time. And that's a profound, I thought storyline for how the world really works, right, in regard to this kind of stuff. And yes, I mentioned Aquino a minute ago, and Aquino does come up in recounts of the Son of Sam stuff. So some people think that there would be a connection to Son of Sam by the Process Church, and Process is often who comes up as this kind of above cult of many serial killer incidents. So the Process Church connects Henry Lee Lucas and the Hand of Death cult. It connects to Manson. Everybody knows, I think, about Manson's Process Church connections. And then Process Church connects to Son of Sam through the fact that the cult that he was in New York was a branch of the Process. And then the Process connects to Jimmy Savile, because Savile has whole interviews in the Process Church magazine, which are still available online. So there is an obvious, definite intelligence background connection to the Process Church, and they were using a lot of Crowley's philosophy, and Crowley groups often connect into British intelligence, for example. So anyway, that's my take on that, is that you can see very clearly through, again, the cult angle, the serial killer angle, the organized crime ties into this, because a lot of the cults and a lot of the serial killers are kind of doing like contract killing. That's another angle in this that people miss. And then I noticed too that, and that's very evident in Savile. Savile seems to have been some kind of contract killing type of person, because he had total immunity, and he would brag about it, that he would never be stopped because he was friends with, the Queen and the King, and then, Prince Charles and the Queen and all this stuff. Anyway, so that's another angle to understand about this stuff. And it's more prevalent than people think. How far they can take a person and plant, say Timothy McVeigh. I'm sure you guys have seen Corbett's excellent breakdown of how he was sheep dipped, and that was basically a planned operation. Do I know if McVeigh was put into something as a child? I don't know about that, but I do think he was sheep dipped and sort of planned for that operation once he had at least gone into the military, for sure. So those are great questions. I don't know about how far they can take and train a child to do something many years later, but there is at least cults that try to do that stuff. I mean, that's exactly right. You're right about Berkowitz. That's what Berkowitz says. He says that we were trained to be these kind of killers.
Yeah. And there's what, Jones?
Oh, I just said that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
If you look at Whitney Webb's deep dives, especially in the Epstein series, where she goes into takes it all the way back to the American Crime Syndicate and Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano.
Yeah, that's what I've been reading into lately. Yeah, exactly. I didn't know she talked about that. Okay. Yeah,
no, I think it's the second article that she wrote in 2019 as part of her Epstein series. But really goes into Samuel Bronfman and the whole bootlegging industry, the Roaring 20s, rise of the American Crime Syndicate, and then the Mafia's connections again with the United States government, with the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the, I guess, emergence of Roy Cohn as a legitimate actor in the DC bubble under Joe McCarthy in the 50s, and just sort of the hand holding that the FBI, the CIA, and the Congress really did with the mafia throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where these relationships became not just integral, but almost like host parasite relationships, where they would take turns being the host and the parasite.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's another, mistake that people think, oh, it's the mafia versus, the intelligence agents or something like that. And it's more like the people at the top of the organized crime are working with the people at the top of the the agencies, right? It's not, so there might be people at the lower levels who are fighting each other. They don't care about that. But yeah, at the top, there's coordination and deals are made. And like you said, this goes all the way back to World War II, at least. Probably, I'm sure before that, there were, I'm sure, deals being struck. I mean, the Sicilian mafia was bringing in all of the heroin, like 95% of the heroin back in the 40s and 50s. And they were able to do that because they had certain deals with the U.S. Navy. In fact, the early Dons back in that period were providing intelligence to the U.S. Navy against Mussolini. Mussolini had a love-hate relationship with Sicilian mafia. And so when he would boot them out and make them angry, then they would give intelligence to the U.S. And there were even some mobsters who were playing both sides of that. There was some that they would feed intelligence to Mussolini, and then they would feed intelligence to the U.S. military. So there's always been that kind of shady dealing going on, and the drug dealing, I think, is the great key here to see this, because really without the coordination of high level generals, people in the military, CIA, the various mafias wouldn't be able to traffic the amounts of drugs that they were. And most of the big amounts of drugs during that period were coming through the mob. I guess nowadays it's cartels, but it's the same principle, right? Of the CIA, for example, will have a deal with a certain cartel to exclude other cartels. That's actually if you watch the movie Sicario, that's actually what's implied in that movie. But yeah, you're absolutely right that this whole angle of the American crime syndicate, and really this is what's behind the assassination of JFK. I mean, probably a lot of people know this, but it was even stumbled upon in the late 70s when they had the RFK had those hearings where they called out Carlos Marcello as basically being one of the key figures in the assassination of JFK, due to RFK going after him and having him exiled out of New Orleans. He was the mafia boss of New Orleans. And so it was pretty much all demonstrated. They found all of these suppressed tapes that the FBI had recorded for like thousands of hours of mob conversations, and it was done in coordination with the CIA. So the CIA actually went to people in the mob and said, hey, could you help us out? We'd like to maybe set you and some of our guys up, probably E. Howard Hunt, people like that, to try to get rid of some of these Kennedys. But that information couldn't be used in court, and so that it really didn't go anywhere. And as you can imagine, I think that's the most plausible scenario, that it was Sam Giancana, elements of the CIA who had given money to different mobsters, particularly through Santos Trafficante, to have JFK taken care of. So it looks like it was people like E. Howard Hunt working with some of these mob figures to get that done.
Well, and wasn't it something that, and ironically enough, that the JFK Oliver Stone film explored, which was the connection between what's his face, not Henry Clay, Clay Shaw and the CIA.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Between him and the mob and the CIA in New Orleans. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. And also the one thing that people overlook is that the CIA and the OSS, they are very interested in having back when it was OSS, they would have people who, let me rephrase this. So the guy who's the prosecutor of Son of Sam was an old OSS guy. So they wanted to make sure that they had the right people there. And then in one of those big serial killer cases, it was, I think, the coroner too. And I think that in the JFK case, right, the coroner is a big deep state figure. So we'll never probably know what was really going on with the body. But that's another great point, is that the intelligence agencies make sure that they have key figures in those kinds of roles of, the coroner or the district attorney and this kind of stuff. So
can we maybe go into a little bit like how this programming actually happens and where they're pulling the doctors and scientists from, and the overlap that has with like advertising and pop culture now?
That's good. Yeah.
And I know that's kind of broad. Yeah. I'm sorry. Like I realize that I just basically asked you to throw like 7 volumes of encyclopedias at us at once. So I mean, the hope is we'll get going somewhere and we may tangent and do, dive deep further a little bit down on it. But I mean, just, it can
really go anywhere.
Right. So basically all of the ad men, if you watch that, the show Mad Men with Don
my
Draper,
ex-wife was obsessed with that
all of
show.
those guys are the guys who were in the OSS. And I think I've not seen all of Mad Men, but isn't Don Draper a former military dude?
Don Draper is, yeah.
And so, those guys in real life who went into the advertisements at Walter Lippmann Agency, and the same guys who were in the OSS who then went on to be the heads of the major CBS, ABC, NBC, they were all also OSS wartime intelligence, psychological warfare guys. So Sarnoff, Paley, those guys who headed up the networks basically took a lot of their wartime intelligence. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you are in charge of psychological warfare in military, you want to influence the enemy and your own people, right? So you want to make sure that your guys have the right frame of mind through the broadcast that you put out, whether it's radio or whether it's pamphlets or whatever it is. And you want to make sure that the enemy gets the message that you want them to have. So that the target population of the enemy is, dejected, demoralized. They lose, have their will, their spirit broken. As Sun Tzu said, most warfare is mental. So if we can convince the enemy to give up, then we've won the war, right? And so they took a lot of the strategies that they had perfected in World War II. And there's a famous book on this by, I think it's Paul Leinbarger. He has one of the classic psychological warfare books. And you can see the way that they do things with convincing people in wartime. It's the exact same model of what you do in advertising, right? You just want to appeal to people to convince them rather than adopting some ideology. You want to convince them to buy your product. So they basically scientifically perfect the technique of advertising, persuasion, even things more maybe malicious and nefarious like subliminals. All this kind of stuff comes out of wartime intelligence. And so they would just basically convince people through the writings and work of Edward Bernays. So I've done, we did a whole lecture series through Global Elite's books. One of those was Propaganda by Bernays. And he talks about how a lot of that wartime, and he used to be the head of, he was like he was a deep state figure who basically renamed the Department of War to call it the Department of Defense, because that's a better selling title. So Bernays, right, he engaged in a lot of these advertising campaigns, right, which got people women smoking cigarettes, everybody eating bacon and eggs for breakfast. He pioneered these like advertising soap campaigns, all this really weird stuff, but it was just testing to see what people responded to and what, convinced them of your position. So what's called Weltanschauungskrieg, or worldview warfare in psychological warfare, then can be applied to the principles of advertising and the principles of social engineering. So that's the way it gets into how pop culture becomes social engineering and culture creation, is that all the same principles are applied to convince people through pop culture of whatever the new ideology is, right? So when I was a kid, the pop culture was, I grew up in the 80s, so it was Reagan era. It was very Americanist, right? It was very much G.I. Joe. It was Star Wars Defense Initiative, Star Wars, George Lucas. It was Terminator, which is all based on DARPA programs that are real, literally. So you can read Annie Jacobson's book where she talks about, I think Kathleen Kennedy, who worked with James Cameron on Terminator 2, and they worked together with people at the Pentagon and DARPA. I mean, this has
They're
gone on.
credited at the end of the film.
Yeah, exactly.
DARPA's credited at the end of the film, just like the Taliban is thanked and called freedom fighters at the end of Rambo 3.
The brave Mujahideen warrior.
Yeah, don't forget.
Which
I think
you can't see now. They edit out. That part's gone for when they show it on like TNT now. They cut that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, people forget too that in the 1987, I think it's Living Daylights, the James Bond with Timothy Dalton, he also aligns with the Taliban. And there's literally a figure who's like a Bin Laden dude. There's like a Bin Laden guy that Timothy Dalton teams up with to fight the Soviets. And a lot of people have forgotten this, but I did a whole show just on that that old 80s Bond movie with Timothy Dalton, because it's like, has everybody forgotten that Timothy Dalton's like hanging out with Bin Laden? And Bin Laden is like this.
He's the worst Bond.
Bin Laden is this Oxford educated dude in the movie. He's like, he's got a British accent, and he's like, "We've got to fight against the Soviets, James." Right? And they're riding horses against these Soviet tanks, and it's ridiculous. But if I recall, there's an old BBC article about Bin Laden getting an Oxford education.
Yeah,
so he was actually trained in Oxford.
And it came out. I don't know if it was BBC, but I do remember reading about Bin Laden and the Bin Laden family's, time in the West and education in the West right after 9/11. Because
I remember exactly. It was in the BBC right after 9/11, and there's a picture of young Bin Laden at Oxford at college or Cambridge, one of the two. And that's relevant because, as we said, if you're going to be an asset for in Western intelligence, especially, I mean, most of the time it's the people that they're recruited at Oxford, Cambridge, or the American, East Coast universities like Harvard, Yale, etc.
Well, and right after 9/11, all flights, around the U.S. were suspended, except for those that were taking the Bin Laden family out of America. So it's not like we didn't have any sort of previous ties with the Bin Ladens at all. I mean,
well, even that Normie documentary by Michael Moore. Remember that, where he
Fahrenheit 9/11. Yeah.
Fahrenheit 9/11.
He showed in that all of the Bush Bin Laden family ties. If you remember that.
Isn't it weird how Michael Moore is allowed to show a particular political truth every once in a while,
at a certain time?
As long as it's couched with a bunch of liberal claptrap, as long as it's equally as divisive as it is informative.
And it can never be preemptive either. It can never teach you how to catch a trend coming.
Yeah.
It's always like after the fact.
Yeah, he's the gatekeeper to documentary filmmaking, as Noam Chomsky is the gatekeeper to philosophy.
Oh my God, yes. Yes, I'm so glad you said that.
Well, I remember 10 years ago, it might have been Luke or Burma. Somebody approached Chomsky and asked him about 9/11, and basically is like, "We don't go there. I can't go there." So it's like, well, now wait a minute. You wrote a book on 9/11, but you can't go there to talk about foreknowledge. And I think the point is that, there's certain people who play those kind of gatekeeper roles that you can only go so far.
So I've had, and I don't know where that echo is coming from, but I've had a couple of pretty extensive conversations with John Kiriakou, who disclosed the CIA torture program, did 32 months of all that kind of stuff. And he's given me two different answers on where he was on 9/11. And he's given me two different answers on his version of the official story of 9/11. And when I talk to other people who were former CIA, or former Department of Defense, when it comes to 9/11, no one will be like, well, of course the official story is nonsense. Nobody is going, and we're getting ready to talk to Richard Gage again. Looking very forward to that, because it's always a fascinating conversation with him. But hopefully we'll go past Building 7 this time. Last time he was on, it was all Building 7. But I
Because
don't
of
know.
the documentary film 7.
Yeah. So I thought that's right. The documentary had just dropped. Have you talked to anyone in intelligence who's actually willing to go on record, former intelligence, willing to go like on record to say, yeah, of course, 9/11 was not what they say it is. Not even what they're saying it was, but just to push back against the official narrative.
I've done 2 interviews with former intelligence people who do discuss that there are questions. I don't recall their exact position on the totality of it. Many years ago, I interviewed the guy who was in charge of the bin Laden unit, Colonel Tony Schaefer. And Colonel Schaefer was involved in Operation Able Danger, which we know the 9/11 Commission basically ignored and covered up. Colonel Schaefer, of course, brought that up and has brought that up for many, many years. It's never been answered because obviously there was something going on with, shady dealings with that. If you remember, too, the head of the bin Laden, I forget that guy's name, but the guy with the beard he went on RT a bunch. He was a CIA handler operative guy who was above the people doing the on the ground. So Colonel Schaefer was doing like the on the ground intelligence stuff, tracking bin Laden, and he was told to not get him when they found him. And then the guy who was in the CIA, he went on RT a bunch. I think he did interviews with Ron Paul about 10 years ago, and he admitted that it was all a bunch of baloney, that the whole bin Laden tracking unit and all that stuff was basically there to cover up and allow bin Laden and these networks to do what they do. The guy's name escapes me, but I mean, he's a famous guy. He quit that unit 10 years ago or whatever it was, 8 years ago. But you can go find his interviews with Ron Paul. But so there's countless examples of stuff like this. And I mean, I even remember the absurdity that stuck out to me with, do you remember, I think it may have been Anderson Cooper. If it wasn't Anderson Cooper, it was somebody from CBS or ABC, that it was during the period after the 1993 World Trade Center bombings. Bin Laden is wanted. He's like on the top. He's on the wanted list, and they're going and interviewing him. And I'm like, so wait a minute. So they can't find him, but these obvious intelligence operative people can go interview him in a cave. I mean, this is so dumb, dude. Right? So it starts to not add up, and then you start realizing that a lot of these people, like al-Zawahiri, right, who's like the number 2 of Al Qaeda or number 3, they all have the same kind of pedigree of being trained in terms of Western, education, Oxford, and so it becomes patently obvious that, to me at least, that Al Qaeda, ISIS, it really was just the same entities that the West had on their Rolodex from the 80s that they ran, the base, right, which becomes just their skeleton key that they can use. I think Andrew Karibko had a good phrase that ISIS and Al Qaeda, these are skeleton keys that wherever there's a place where the West wants to do something or move in or have if there's oil or if there's some natural resource that they want to get a hold of, magically ISIS, Al Qaeda, Taliban can pop up there, and then it becomes the excuse to police that region. So I think Karibko is correct about that. And I forgot. I'm rambling. I forgot where we were with this.
Well,
question.
I found footage of 1998 Osama bin Laden interview with ABC's John Miller.
That's it. That's the one.
And
not to mention, a couple months ago, PBS interviewed, I forgot his name, but PBS interviewed like a member of al-Nusra in Syria. But he's all like suited up, and he's got like hair gel and beard gel, and he's like, well, we're actually reformed Al-Qaeda. We're reformed terrorists. We don't really believe in that barbarism. We just happen to be occupying Syria.
It was in the New York Times about 5 years ago that al-Baghdadi, I'm not joking, you guys may remember it, was literally a former actor. Actor.
Yeah.
In the New York Times.
When we cut this interview on YouTube and finish it over on Rockfin here in about 7 minutes, I'll play that clip of ABC's John Miller interviewing Osama bin Laden in 1998. A mere 3 years before he would be blamed for the next World Trade Center attack, and then what? Just 6 years after the first, 6 or 4? Was that 94? The first World Trade? That was Bill Clinton, right? 93.
And which we know from Imad Salam that because he recorded the conversations that was an entrapment operation.
Yeah. So we'll play that clip here in about 5 minutes when we stop streaming on YouTube, and we'll finish the rest of this interview only on the Rockfin, because there's some stuff that we're going to go into the last little bit here that will probably get us booted off. Can
I use the restroom real quick when you guys do that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, if you got to, at any time you got to take a minute, just let us know. We can transition.
Just let me go TT real quick.
For sure, man. For sure. The relationship that the United States government, the United States media has had with Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, and like Al Qaeda and all of these
just terrorists in general.
Well, you remember one of the most prominent. You remember one of the most prominent. Just a side note, journalists in the world, even Cy Hirsch, caught on to this, and maybe he's a little bit of a gatekeeper, or maybe I don't know, but he's been pretty consistent with his journalism, like the Red Line in Syria. Calling out that the bin Laden stuff was staged. I mean, remember that where Cy Hirsch came out and said it was fake? Yeah. Because obviously it was. It's like, duh.
Well, and just a couple of years ago, the recording that Ed Butowski made with Cy Hirsch, not with Cy Hirsch's knowledge, where they're talking about Seth Rich and where they're talking. Have you heard that?
I didn't know about this. Tell me about that.
Okay, I'll send that to you, by the way. Ed Butowski got Cy Hirsch on the phone, and for anybody watching who doesn't know who Ed Butowski was, he was the private detective that was looking into Seth Rich's murder, and represented by a guy named Ty Clevenger, who we've had on the show before. He's coming back on. Ty Clevenger is the lawyer who's filed all of the Freedom of Information Act requests around the Seth Rich case, was the person who was able to get a hold of the fact that, oh yes, as a matter of fact, the FBI did have Seth Rich's laptop. At any rate, Cy Hirsch is on the phone, like all but spelling out the Democratic Party's involvement in Seth Rich's murder. And there's like 22 minutes of audio that was released out of this. It's Cy Hirsch, so it sounds like his whiskey is smoking a cigarette after it just had sex. Like that's, the tone of his voice. But when you kind of like just actually focus on what's being said, there's a lot of information that gets dropped in it. We may as well go ahead and drop the YouTube and pick up the rest of it on the Rockfin. That clip's about 2 minutes, Jay. I'll roll that. You can get up and do your thing.
By the way, the guy I was trying to think of is Michael Scheuer. He was the guy that was the head of the bin Laden unit. And then when he resigned, he said that there was something. He said that the U.S. didn't. I'm trying to remember what his resignation statement. It was on RT or maybe with Ron Paul, but it was something like the U.S. doesn't want to end this whole scenario of the war on terror, something like that. Which was a pretty good admission.
So with that, we're going to go ahead and drop the rock.